The world remembers Marilyn Monroe in a white dress. But the first important paper in her life wasn't a movie contract. It was a marriage certificate. And she signed it at 16. And the date was June 19th, 1942. Before the diamonds, before the studio lights, before the photographers learned how to turn her face into a fantasy, Norma Jeane was a young girl with a problem nobody could solve gently. She needed a home, not a mansion, not fame, not romance, a home. The people caring for her were moving away, and Norma Jeane couldn't simply go with them. If nothing changed, she could be sent back into the kind of life she already knew too well. Foster homes, orphanage rules, borrowed rooms, and the quiet fear of not belonging anywhere for long. Then came James Dougherty, a neighbor, a young man, a possible answer. And suddenly, marriage wasn't just marriage. It was safety. It was escape. It was a door that opened before every other door closed. That's why this story matters. Because Marilyn Monroe didn't begin as a legend chasing love. She began as Norma Jeane, a 16-year-old girl trying to keep from being left behind. Before we open that marriage paper any further, if you want Marilyn remembered this way, not as gossip, not as a headline, but as Norma Jeane before the world renamed her, then like this video, subscribe, and stay with us. Because to understand why she married at 16, we can't begin with fame. We have to begin with the girl who simply needed a home. So we begin with the paper. Not the movie contract, not the magazine cover. Just a marriage paper from June 1942, with a young girl's name on it, Norma Jeane. That name matters. If we rush past it, we lose the girl this story is really about. At first, the paper looks ordinary. A date, a signature, a husband's name, a young bride's name written into a record. The kind of document people file away and only pull out years later when a life has become famous enough for every small detail to feel larger. But in that moment, it wasn't famous. It wasn't history. It wasn't Marilyn Monroe. It was a 16-year-old girl stepping into marriage before she'd ever had the chance to fully step into herself. James Dougherty stood beside her. He wasn't part of the studio world that would later shape her face, her voice, and even her name. He belonged to the ordinary neighborhood life around her, before fame turned every early detail into a clue. And that's why the paper feels different. It didn't arrive at the beginning of a grand romance. It arrived at the end of a problem. Norma Jeane needed somewhere to belong. And by the end of this story, that marriage paper won't feel like a simple wedding record. It will feel like proof of a moment when marriage became the safest-looking door in front of a girl who had already watched too many doors close. Norma Jeane was born in Los Angeles on June 1st, 1926. That sounds like the beginning of a Hollywood story now, because we already know the name she'd become. We know the photographs. We know the smile. We know the soft voice moviegoers later remembered. But in 1926, there was no Marilyn Monroe. There was only Norma Jeane Mortensen, a baby girl born into a life that didn't have the steady shape a child needs. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, worked in the film business as a film cutter. So in a strange way, Hollywood was near Norma Jeane before she ever stood in front of a camera. But it wasn't the Hollywood of premieres and applause. It was the working side of it. The side with long hours, pressure, and a young mother who couldn't give her child a settled home. Norma Jeane spent much of her childhood in foster homes and also lived in the Los Angeles orphans' home. That fact is often repeated quickly, but it carries a whole world inside it. A child learns from rooms. She learns who opens the door, who closes it, who stays, who leaves, who is allowed to decide. For many children, home is the place you return to without asking. For Norma Jeane, home often depended on adults, paperwork, health, money, permission, and timing. By the time she was a teenager, one fear had become familiar. A home could vanish. So when another move came in 1942, it didn't feel small. It felt like the old fear returning in a new dress. By 1942, Norma Jeane was living with Grace and Doc Goddard in Van Nuys. For a while, it looked close to ordinary. She was attending Van Nuys High School. She had a bed, a routine, a neighborhood. A life that could almost make a girl believe the ground might finally stay still. Then Doc Goddard's work pulled the family toward West Virginia. For another girl, a move might have meant packing boxes and saying goodbye to friends. For Norma Jeane, it meant something sharper. The Goddards couldn't simply take her out of California with them. And if another plan wasn't made, she faced the possibility of returning to the orphanage or another placement. That was the door behind her. Not a romantic choice, a practical fear. Where would she go? Who would keep her? Who had the right to decide? Near the Goddards lived James Dougherty. He was 5 years older than Norma Jeane, and he became the answer the adults could see. Marriage would give her a household, a legal place, a name tied to someone responsible for her. So the marriage paper came forward. At first glance, it could look like a beginning. A young bride, a husband, a date, a new last name. But underneath it, there was pressure. Because Norma Jeane wasn't choosing between two easy futures. She was choosing between a marriage she was too young to fully understand and the fear of being sent away again. But the solution asked a girl to step into a grown woman's role before she'd had time to finish being a child. Hold on that for a moment, because this is where the story can easily be misunderstood. If we look at the 16-year-old bride and only see Marilyn Monroe, we miss the whole point. We bring the fame backward. We bring the diamonds, the white dress, the movie posters, the soft voice, and the studio lights into a room where they don't belong yet. That girl wasn't Marilyn. Not yet. She was Norma Jeane, a teenager who'd already learned that home could be temporary. A girl who knew what it felt like to wait while adults discussed where she should go. A girl who understood, far too early, that being wanted and being secure were not always the same thing. So when she stepped into marriage, it wasn't the beginning of a Hollywood legend. It was a survival choice made inside a very small corner. And that's why we have to treat it carefully. Not as scandal, not as a strange little fact before fame, as the moment when Norma Jeane tried to solve the oldest problem in her young life. Where do I belong? For a while, the answer came with a new name, a new home, and a husband. But the world was already changing around her, and Norma Jeane, the young wife who had married to stay safe, was about to be seen in a way she couldn't have planned. The wedding took place on June 19, 1942. Norma Jeane had turned 16 just 18 days earlier. She should have still been thinking about school. Instead, she was becoming Mrs. Dougherty, a roof, a legal answer, a way to stay out of the orphanage. After the wedding, the paper had done what the adults needed it to do. Norma Jeane had a husband now, a household, a new name, and with that came the kind of protection the world understood in 1942. But protection can be complicated, because the same paper that kept her from being sent away also moved her out of girlhood. She left high school and stepped into the role of a young wife. The routines around her changed. The expectations changed. The way people looked at her changed. One day, she was a schoolgirl whose future had to be arranged. Then she was a married woman, so the marriage paper begins to change. At first, it looked like rescue. Now it starts to look like a trade. Norma Jeane gained a home, but she lost time. And soon, the war would change that home too. James Dougherty later went away for service, and Norma Jeane's new life shifted again. That's the strange thing about a marriage that was supposed to make her safe. Almost as soon as it gave her a settled place, the world around that place began moving. America was deep in wartime. Men were being shipped out, and women were stepping into factories and workrooms. Norma Jeane went to work at the Radioplane Company in Van Nuys, a wartime factory. This wasn't a studio. It wasn't a screen test. It wasn't a dressing room with makeup lights and gowns waiting on a rack. It was a factory. Work clothes, machinery, noise, parts. Women doing their part while men were overseas. And still, the camera found her. In late 1944, photographer David Conover came to the factory while working with the U.S. Army Air Force's 1st Motion Picture Unit. His assignment was to photograph women helping the war effort. He wasn't there to find Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn didn't exist yet. He saw Norma Jeane Dougherty, a young woman in work clothes, a wife whose husband was away, a girl who had married to stay safe, now standing in a factory, while another kind of future quietly entered the room. They showed Norma Jeane a door she hadn't been offered before, a door that didn't begin with someone else deciding where she should live, a door that didn't ask her to be someone's responsibility, a door that looked, for the first time, like choice. Now the marriage paper changes meaning again. On one side was the life arranged when she was 16. On the other side was something uncertain, but alive. Pause there, because this is another place where Marilyn's story can become too simple. People love the idea of one photograph changing everything. It sounds clean. A factory girl is seen by a photographer, and suddenly the future opens. But Norma Jeane's life wasn't that neat. The camera didn't rescue her in one flash. It didn't know why she'd married at 16. It didn't know the orphanage, the foster homes, the borrowed rooms, or the fear of being sent away. The camera only saw the surface first. A young woman with bright features, a softness in her face, an ease when the lens turned toward her. But maybe that's why the moment matters. For most of her young life, Norma Jeane had been looked at as someone to place, protect, manage, or move. The camera looked at her differently. Not perfectly, not deeply, but differently. It saw possibility. And for a girl who'd grown up inside other people's decisions, possibility could feel like air coming into a closed room. Still, we shouldn't mistake being seen for being known. That would become one of the great aches of Marilyn Monroe's life. The world would learn how to look at her very quickly. It would take much longer for anyone to ask who was standing behind the look. Norma Jeane didn't step from the factory straight into fame. That's important. After those factory photographs, Norma Jeane began modeling. At first, it wasn't movie star work. It wasn't her name in lights. It was small assignments, careful posing, and learning what the camera wanted. In January 1945, she left the factory. In August of that year, she signed with the Blue Book Model Agency. The name sounds small now beside Marilyn Monroe, but for Norma Jeane it was a real step into a world where her effort and ambition began to matter. She studied, she practiced, she showed up. By early 1946, her face had appeared on many magazine covers. Think about what that means. Only a few years earlier, she'd been a schoolgirl with an uncertain home, then a teenage wife, then a factory worker. Now her face was being printed, mailed, clipped, and kept. The world was starting to look at her. But looking is not the same as knowing. That's where the ache begins to grow. Because the more Norma Jeane was seen, the more the old marriage paper started to feel like it belonged to another life. A life built around keeping her safe. A life meant to make her settled. A life that had answered where she could stay, but not who she might become. James Dougherty had married a young girl from his neighborhood. But while he was away, Norma Jeane was changing. Not suddenly, not completely, but enough. Her photographs became more polished. Her modeling work became regular. Her confidence in front of the camera grew. And with every new photograph, the distance widened between Mrs. Dougherty and the woman the camera kept pulling forward. The quiet separation didn't begin in a courtroom. It began in front of a lens. So now we can answer the question clearly. Why did Marilyn Monroe marry at just 16 years old? Because Marilyn Monroe didn't. Norma Jeane did. And she did it before the world knew her face, before the studios changed her name, before the blonde image became larger than the woman inside it. In 1942, Norma Jeane was not choosing between a calm childhood and a wild romance. She wasn't choosing from a long list of gentle possibilities. Her choice was shaped by pressure. Doc Goddard's job was taking the Goddards away from California. They couldn't simply bring Norma Jeane with them. If another arrangement wasn't made, she faced the possibility of returning to the orphanage. That was the locked door behind her. Marriage was the open door in front. And when we say it plainly, the story becomes much more human than the old headline, Marilyn married at 16. Sounds like a strange fact about a famous woman. But Norma Jeane married so she wouldn't be sent away again. Feels different. It brings the girl back into the room. That's why the marriage paper matters. It wasn't only a record of a wedding. It was the official answer to a private fear, a date, a signature, a husband's name, a young girl's name, and behind all of it, one quiet question. Where can she go now? The paper made her someone's wife. In the world of 1942, that meant something adults could point to. It gave her a household. It gave her a legal place. It seemed to settle the question, but the cost was hidden inside the safety. Because Norma Jeane was 16, she didn't get to grow slowly into adulthood. She was moved into it. That's not a fairy tale. It's not gossip either. It's something quieter and sadder. A practical decision wrapped around a child's need for protection. The marriage gave her safety. The camera gave her possibility. And between those two words, Norma Jeane's young life began to pull in opposite directions. By 1946, the girl from the marriage paper was already changing in public. Her hair was lighter. Her photographs were smoother. Her face was being studied by people who knew how to sell an image before they knew how to understand a person. And somewhere in that change, the old name began to feel fragile. Norma Jeane Dougherty belonged to the marriage. It belonged to the neighborhood. It belonged to the girl who'd signed a paper because she needed somewhere to go. But the studios were not looking for Mrs. Dougherty. They were looking for someone they could name, shape, and place in front of an audience. In August 1946, Norma Jeane signed her first contract with 20th Century Fox. The studio world was opening, but it wasn't opening as a warm room where a young woman could simply walk in as herself. It came with conditions, a new look, a new identity that could fit on posters, call sheets, publicity stills, and casting files. Ben Lyon, a Fox executive, helped choose the name Marilyn. Norma Jeane chose Monroe, a family name from her mother's side. Marilyn Monroe. Two words that would later become impossible to separate from the face, the voice, the smile, the photographs, and the whole bright image. But listen to how different that name feels beside the marriage paper. Norma Jeane Dougherty was a young wife created by urgency. Marilyn Monroe was a studio name created for possibility. One name was meant to settle her. The other was meant to sell her. And between those two names stood a young woman still trying to understand where she belonged. At 16, the situation needed a wife. At 20, the studio needed a starlet. Both times, a name changed the room around her. Mrs. Dougherty made her safer. Marilyn Monroe made her visible. But neither name fully answered the deeper question that had followed her since childhood. Who gets to know the real girl underneath? By 1946, the marriage had reached the place many young marriages reach, when two people are no longer moving toward the same life. Only this one carried a different kind of sadness. Norma Jeane and James Dougherty hadn't begun with a normal amount of freedom. They'd begun with pressure. They'd begun with a problem adults were trying to solve. They'd begun with a 16-year-old girl who needed protection, and a young man who became part of the answer. For a while, that answer worked. It kept Norma Jeane from being sent back into uncertainty. It gave her a home. It gave her a name. But by 1946, Norma Jeane wasn't only Mrs. Dougherty anymore. She was a working model. She was a young woman with magazine covers behind her and a studio contract in front of her. The name Marilyn was arriving. The image was forming. The future needed more room. And that's where the marriage paper began to lose its power. A paper can make a marriage legal. It can give a girl a household. It can protect her from one kind of danger. But it can't keep two lives from changing in different directions. James Dougherty had married Norma Jeane before the cameras found her. Before the hair was lightened. Before the studio renamed her. Before strangers began seeing something in her face that they wanted to print and remember. He had married a girl from the neighborhood, but Hollywood was asking for someone else. The divorce was finalized in September 1946. No great public scene surrounded it then. No world of photographers waiting outside to turn her private change into performance. It was quieter than that, and maybe that's why it's easy to pass over. But we shouldn't. Because the end of this first marriage tells us something important. The solution that saved her at 16 could not carry her at 20. At 16, marriage had looked like the safest door. At 20, staying inside that same door may have meant closing another one. The marriage wasn't meaningless. It wasn't just a mistake. For a time, it had been shelter. But shelter is not always home forever. Sometimes shelter is the place that keeps you alive long enough to find the next door. Years later, once Marilyn Monroe had become one of the most photographed women in the world, people looked back at that first marriage and often treated it like a small, strange chapter. A teenage bride, a first husband, a quiet divorce before fame, something to mention quickly before moving on to the famous years. But that's too easy, because the first marriage explains something that followed Norma Jeane long after the wedding ended. It explains how early safety and surrender became tangled together in her life. At 16, she wasn't handed safety the way a child should be handed safety, freely, gently, without having to become useful to someone else's plan. She was given safety through a role, a wife, a name, a household, a paper. And later, Hollywood would do something strangely similar. It would not simply say, "Come as you are." It would say, "Become this, and we'll open the door. Become lighter-haired. Become easier to photograph. Become easier to sell. Become Marilyn Monroe. Be what the room needs, and maybe the room will keep you." That's why her first marriage shouldn't be treated like gossip. It's one of the earliest windows into the woman behind the later image. It shows us a girl learning, far too young, that belonging could come with conditions. They mistook being wanted for being understood, and those two things were never the same. So now, when we look at that marriage paper one final time, it doesn't feel ordinary anymore. It doesn't feel like a small record from 1942. It feels like something much more human. A young girl's name, a date, a signature, a husband beside her, and behind it all, the quiet fear of being sent away again. That's what the paper carries. Not scandal, not glamour, not the kind of romance people might expect when they hear the name Marilyn Monroe. It carries Norma Jeane, 16 years old, still too young to know what life would ask of her, still old enough to understand that homes could disappear, still standing in a world where adults were trying to solve her future with the fastest answer they had: marriage. At the beginning, that paper looked like safety. Then it looked like pressure. Then, beside the factory photographs, it looked like the line between the life chosen for her and the life she was beginning to choose for herself. And now, at the end, it becomes proof that before Marilyn Monroe was ever built by studios, photographers, fan magazines, and movie lights, Norma Jeane had already been asked to become someone else in order to survive. At 16, she became a wife so she wouldn't have to become an orphan again. That's the truth at the center of this story. Because the marriage wasn't just about James Dougherty. It wasn't only about a wedding, or young love, or paperwork, or the customs of another time. It was about a girl who needed a place to stay. A girl who'd already known what it felt like to be moved. A girl who was trying, in the only way offered to her, to hold on to something that looked like home. If that paper has a final meaning, it's this. It wasn't the beginning of Marilyn Monroe. It was the evidence of Norma Jeane's first adult bargain with the world. Safety, but at a cost. A home, but with a role. A new name, but not yet a full choice. So let's not end this story with the famous Marilyn. Not yet. Not with the white dress. Not with diamonds. Not with flashbulbs. Not with the image the world learned to repeat. Let's end with Norma Jeane in motion. A young woman leaving the factory after a long day, her work clothes still plain, the noise of the machines fading behind her, the California light outside the building soft on her face. Behind her is the marriage paper that once gave her a place to stay. Ahead of her is the camera that will offer a different kind of door. And inside her there's still Norma Jeane, the girl who wanted safety, the young woman learning ambition, the person still hoping that being seen might one day mean being understood. So when people ask why Marilyn Monroe married at just 16 years old, the answer is not just a date or a name. It's a whole childhood standing behind one piece of paper. She married because the adults around her needed an answer. She married because the home she had was about to vanish. She married because, at 16, becoming someone's wife looked safer than becoming nobody's responsibility. And long before the world looked at Marilyn Monroe and saw a star, there was Norma Jeane, a young girl trying to hold on to a home before Hollywood ever asked her to hold on to an image. If this story helped you see Marilyn not just as a legend, but as Norma Jeane, young, vulnerable, and still trying to find her place, then like this video, subscribe, and stay with us. Here, we remember Marilyn carefully, not as gossip, not as a headline, but as a real woman, with a real past, and a story that deserves to be handled gently.